Hello and welcome to the World Today. I'm Temitope Fagbemi. We're starting to this program in the United States, where violence erupted last night in the U.S. town of Ferguson after a jury decided not to bring charges over the killing of a black teenager. Michael Brown was shot by a white police officer, Darren Wilson, on August the 9th, sparking protest. Our colleague at the Voice of America, Kane Ferguson, witnessed the violence, and he tells us more.
Ferguson, Missouri is burning. The reaction to the decision not to charge Officer Darren Wilson was almost immediate violence by some in the crowd that assembled outside the Ferguson Police Department.
You are all unlawfully assembled if you are in the middle of the street.
Police responded with tear gas. And protesters reacted by setting fires. Soon after the announcement, things here escalated quickly. Behind me, you can see that we've got 2 police cars fully engulfed in flames, and this is all coming as riot police are fully deployed here, ready to tackle whatever these protesters throw at them. Violence was not on the agenda for the Ferguson resident who goes by the name Django.
I pray for the best, you know, because me personally, I'm not going to go destroy nothing. I want it to be a better outcome, you know.
How y'all doing, officer?
A prevailing concern was that the violence would overshadow efforts to resolve the racial tension Django says exists between Ferguson's residents and its police force.
We got a reason to be out here. We live here. This is our area. So that means if he got away with it, he gonna get away with it, he gonna get away with it, he gonna get away with it.
The lesson is that all of us need to be at the table talking. And it shouldn't be just one race trying to speak up for the inequities that we see.
Mark Esters found himself trapped behind a police line formed to keep people away from the heart of the escalating unrest in Ferguson. Though he was disappointed by the violence, he was not surprised.
This is something that's been a culmination of years of inequity.
Scenes of looting in Ferguson aflame made this St. Louis suburb look more like a war zone than a small town. It was overwhelming to Julie Cruz.
I've had enough. I've had enough of racism and bigotry, and St. Louis can do better.
Once the fires are put out and the violence ends, Ferguson will need to be rebuilt by repairing the structures that were damaged, destroyed, or looted, and by improving the relationship between the police force and its citizens.
We have the right to fight for our freedom!
In the meantime, the cities of New York, Washington, D.C. and California also witnessed protest over the grand jury's decision not to charge police officer Darren Wilson for murder. President Barack Obama had to join the teenager's family to appeal for calm. He urged Americans to accept the decision.
The duty of the grand jury is to separate fact from fiction. After a full and impartial and critical examination of all the evidence in the law, and decide if that evidence supported the filing of any criminal charges against Darren Wilson. They accepted and completed this monumental responsibility in a conscientious and expeditious manner.
After the announcement, protesters marched in New York, Washington, D.C., California, and in Missouri. In Chicago, Illinois, civil rights leader J.C. Jackson called for continued rallies against the Missouri grand jury's decision.
Every town has its own Ferguson and its own Michael Brown. We want the violence to end. It's police violence against the people. Domestic violence is abhorrent and wrong. But when one has a gun and a badge and the authority of the state, paid to serve and protect, becomes the executioner, that's unacceptable.
The peaceful protest was a stark contrast to the violence in Ferguson, Missouri. Violence flared in St. Louis suburb of Ferguson, with gunshots heard, looting and fires after the grand jury's decision. In his reaction, President Barack Obama issued an appeal for restraint by protesters and the police.
First and foremost, we are a nation built on the rule of law. And so we need to accept that this decision was the grand jury's to make. There are Americans who agree with it, and there are Americans who are deeply disappointed, even angry. It's an understandable reaction.
The jury was made up of 12 randomly picked citizens, 9 of which were white and 3 black. At least 9 votes were needed in order to issue an indictment.
Joining us on the World Today via telephone is the Voice of America's Ken Farrell. He's in Ferguson, Missouri. You're welcome to the program, Ken.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, I'm aware that the Missouri governor declared a state of emergency last week in anticipation of violence after the grand jury's decision. So what happened yesterday night? How did the protest degenerate into such violence?
Well, I don't think anybody was prepared for the nature or the amount of violence that actually occurred last night. I mean, you know, there was widespread gunfire, there was widespread looting. I mean, almost instantly as the verdict was read, the crowd became agitated and began to go after police vehicles. I was actually not far from the Ferguson Police Department when protesters set fire to 2 of the police vehicles there. You know, we kept actually scrambling because at certain points you would hear people say, they're firing bullets, or, you know, tear gas canisters would be fired into the crowd. And, I mean, it was an entirely chaotic scene, and ultimately all of this just escalated into violence widespread all across Ferguson.
So what is the situation now? Has calm returned to Ferguson?
Well, I'm actually at the front of Ferguson that was completely ablaze last night. I'm standing just about 20 feet away from a beauty store that was completely engulfed in flames. It is now completely gone. Today, in the daylight, you can see just the extent of the destruction. I mean, an entire street, probably about a mile or 2 long, several kilometers long, is completely gone. I mean, there might be 15 businesses that were completely torched and burned to the ground last night. And from what we're gathering from police reports, there might have been about 65 people arrested. And so far, all we can tell is about 2 of the people among those 65 that were arrested are actually residents of Ferguson. So that leads one to believe that a lot of people here instigating the violence or doing a lot of the destruction were people that don't actually live in Ferguson.
So, Ken, tell me, is this the end of the Michael Brown case? Is the grand jury's decision, is it final? Have we had the last of this case?
It's really the end of the state's ability to prosecute Darren Hogan on any sort of charges. You know, he is not going to be charged in the shooting death of Michael Brown. However, there is still a federal investigation by the Justice Department that's underway right now. And also, Michael Brown's family can pursue civil legal action against Darren Wilson of the Ferguson Police Department. But right now, the more immediate state charges against, Missouri state charges against Darren Wilson won't be going forward. And, you know, he is actually free and can return to duty if he so chooses, but what Darren Wilson will do next is sort of uncertain, but it's highly likely that he'll be able to return to service for the Ferguson Police Department.
Okay. Well, now, just yesterday we had reports that a 12-year-old boy was killed in Cleveland for brandishing a fake gun. How common are this type of killings in the United States?
Well, trying to put that into some sort of equation, I mean, you know, any time it happens is a tragedy. This shouldn't happen whatsoever. But I think, I don't actually have statistics or figures, but I think that these cases, like the Darren Wilson, Michael Brown case, this most recent case in Cleveland, reinforce that, you know, there is a problem here that probably needs to be addressed. And I think that what's happening here in Ferguson is the explosion of a lot of these underlying racial tensions that have kind of brought to the surface that people believe are in some ways motivated or behind some of these killings. But I mean, what they are, at the end of the day, it's just an unfortunate tragedy. And how to prevent those unfortunate tragedies is what law enforcement and community leaders are trying to figure out.
Well, thank you very much for joining us on the World Today. Ken Farrell is the Voice of America's correspondent. He's been covering events in Ferguson, Missouri.